really was a pleasure to get the phone call earlier this year to invite me to give the Don Grant Memorial Lecture. It's an even greater pleasure to have Don's family here. That was a surprise I didn't know about, and I think it's wonderful. So welcome. Okay. I'm talking about someone called Grannie Ferris, midwife, nurse, doctor, and undertaker. And following on the theme of occupations, I decided that Grannie was an absolutely perfect example of who I should be using as the subject of my talk. You might ask who Grannie Ferris is. Well, if you lived around Ocean Grove and talked to any of the locals, everybody knows about Grannie Ferris. And when I moved to Ocean Grove permanently about 1992, and word spread there was this weird bird who spent her time in cemeteries, every time I went up the main street, somebody would bail me up and said, "Hey, Grannie Ferris and a couple of babies are buried on Pacey's Hill. You know that, don't you?" And I'm going, where's Pacey's Hill? You don't know where Pacey's Hill is? I wasn't a local at that stage. So first off, I obviously had to find out where Pacey's Hill was. I also had to find out who the hell Grannie Ferris was and who were the couple of babies buried there. I found Pacey's Hill. Grannie Ferris wasn't buried there. And we found between 15 and 19 confirmed burials on this private property. And to say that I was absolutely sucked into this research would be an understatement. But Grannie, and she looked pretty formidable, Grannie was responsible for sidetracking me on so many avenues of research. And it's ironic when I talk about Grannie, midwife, nurse, doctor, undertaker, that I now work for undertakers. I think I've sort of come the full circle. The two that I'm going to focus on most are midwife and nurse, but let's go a bit further and find out. Grannie was actually born in Gloucester in England. She came to Australia, mainly South Australia, then to Victoria, and then ended up on Pacey's Hill. Why is it called Pacey's Hill? Because Mr. and Mrs. Pacey lived on the hill long after Grannie. And she was married twice, had several children, and her name originally was Susanna Smith. She married a Chambers and then she married a Ferris. And so we ended up with Grannie Ferris, and everyone knows Grannie Ferris. We asked the question, was she a qualified midwife, nurse, doctor, or undertaker? And I think the answer is a resounding no. Or maybe I should just say probably not, because she did actually fill all of these roles as a female in the late 19th century and early 20th century. If we have a look at her role as a midwife, in that top corner up here, you'll actually find that Mrs. Ferris, as it's spelled, not Ferris, was the midwife for various children on different birth certificates. And you'll also find her mentioned in various inquests. Not that she had the habit of knocking people off, but she was called as a witness in quite a few different inquests. And in those statements in the inquest, she was classified as a midwife and sometimes as a nurse. If we look a bit further to the area of nurse and doctor, Grannie was a fascinating person, and I was so pleased that this was in the early 90s in Ocean Grove, when some of our octogenarians were still alive at that time. And they were people who remembered playing around Granny's cemetery, not her burial ground, but the cemetery that she maintained on her property, and the role she filled as an undertaker. She was a doctor because she was the local person with more experience than anyone else. And the roads from Ocean Grove to the nearest doctor in either Drysdale or Geelong were not worth thinking about. And so if people needed a doctor, or they needed a nurse, or they needed a midwife, they went to Granny. And if they were dead, their relatives went to Granny to bury them. And she appeared in many articles in the local newspapers and some rather infamous stories that have appeared in different diaries and also as oral history in the area. Now, you remember that early photo of Granny. As I said, formidable. That is not a strong enough word to describe Granny. Now, she lived in an area called Newington, which surrounds Ocean Grove on Bass Strait. And the area is famous for the first apple orchards and the first pear orchards in Victoria. And there were a lot of itinerant workers around who had a habit of injuring themselves, cutting themselves, hurting themselves, and of course they always ended up at Granny's back door. And she used to run a daily clinic. All you had to do was to turn up at her back door and she would look after you, whatever the problem was. She got called out one night to give birth, help with the delivery of an infant, a baby, and a neighbour. And it was the middle of night, very dark night, very overcast, no bright moon, and she always carried with her her famous walking stick, which had a gnarled top, and it actually came from an old fruit tree and had then been chopped down to be the right size for Granny. She could grip the gnarled top and use it as her walking stick. Anyway, when she got called out on this night, she decided to ride the horse, which she often did, and she had her walking stick with her, so she's riding off to meet up with this family, and the wife was about to give birth. And after midnight, and she got waylaid in the dark by somebody trying to rob her. Now, Granny was dedicated to being a midwife, and someone trying to rob her was not going to get in her way, so she whacked him over the head with her walking stick, got rid of him, rode on, delivered the baby, rode home. Next morning, opened up the kitchen door for her daily clinic, and there was one of the itinerant workers who'd hurt his head working in the orchard, and he stood up in a hurry and bashed his head on one of the fruit trees. And Granny said, "Come in, my son." Sits him down at the table, has a good look. I recognise that shape. Word was she wasn't exactly gentle stitching up the wound. Does anyone blame her? Now, the other story about Granny, and I have tried to get confirmation and documents to prove this, I have had some assistance from the chemical company that produces Savlon, because Granny was famous for this balm. She was also called the local herb lady, and she used to make up this little balm that she would put in old Vespa boxes. And if somebody had an injury, she would give them a small box of it to take with them to help heal the wound. And it is believed that her grandson sold the recipe and it became Savlon antiseptic cream. I would love to be able to prove it. As I said, it's a long, slow process working with the archivists at the company involved, but they're a bit hesitant to come forth with all the information. But certainly descendants of the family were quite adamant that it was part of their oral history. And from what we have heard, it would not surprise me in the least. Now, as far as Undertaker goes, there are death certificates around which showed that people were buried, and the wording is, in the ground of Edmund Ferris, Newington, and misspelling of Ferris, which was Granny's surname. I've researched all of the land. There is only one plot of land, and we have proceeded to prove that this is the burial ground. There were never any headstones. On some of these death certificates, it states that the Undertaker was Thomas Butler. Thomas was the local chippy who used to make coffins, and he also was a person who registered or signed that somebody was buried somewhere. He happened to be the father-in-law of Granny's daughter. Some of the witnesses on these deaths and burials, one of them in particular, Charles Fox, was the family of Granny's daughter-in-law. There's a lot of family involved in these burials, and also a lot of neighbours and people in the area. And some diaries that we have at the Bellarine Historical Society have helped prove that this isn't just a story about Granny and a couple of babies. So much so that we did a detailed study of the cemetery, and we compiled enough proof that Heritage Victoria was satisfied in our claims, and it has been listed as a heritage archaeological site, being a private burial ground. And they were more than happy with the evidence. Now, it was quite funny. You'll see this photograph here and this plaque. The plaque was put there a couple of decades prior to when we searched for it by the family and the descendants to commemorate the pioneers of this area. And they were descendants of Grannie Ferris. And we heard about the plaque, but because the land had been used for agricultural purposes and it was on a hill, it was always ploughed around the hill, because anyone who knows anything about land, you don't plough down a hill and you then end up with erosion and problems with water and everything else. So they ploughed around the hill from the top, and every time they did that, another layer of soil covered up this plaque that was in the ground. So I made lots of inquiries locally and eventually got hold of a bloke who said, I dug the hole. And I said, you what? And he said, I dug the hole. And turned out he dug the hole, put in the cement into which this plaque was placed. And I said, well, do you know roughly where it was? Yeah. Well, it turned out he had a scribbled note from way back then, and the distance from the corner of the house and a right angle from the fence near the pear tree was where he dug the hole. And he said, I just got to work out where I put that note. It was about 5 nights later I got a phone call, me undies drawer. And I went, oh, I don't know if I want to touch this note. Anyway, sure enough, he had the note. Now, we also had these 3 octogenarians who are no longer with us, but who were pioneers. They were born and bred in Ocean Grove and Newington, and they knew everything. And all of them had told me that they had played around the picket fence that had belladonna lilies in it and the herbs that Granny grew, and that's where everyone was buried, inside the picket fence. And I said, well, there's no sign of it now. Do you reckon you'd know? Oh, definitely. So I got permission from the landowners to go onto the property, and on 3 separate days I took 1 octogenarian with me each day. And blow me down, these 3 people, one had 2 walking sticks, not Granny's, one had 1, and the other one was, I'm fine, and they all went to a point that they pointed to, it was that far apart, the three places they pointed to, and nothing on the ground to identify it. But they just remembered, there's the pear tree, that's where we used to play, that's the picket fence, so that's where they're buried. And so through the Historical Society, we came across a bloke who had a very expensive, high-power metal detector. And he agreed to come along. So we planned this day. And we had a group of volunteers from our Historical Society, the guy with his metal detector, the note from the undies drawer, and I had this huge roll of Kevlar string that I'd spent several hours the night before measuring to the nth degree and marking. And the beauty of Kevlar string is it doesn't stretch or give. And so I had this string all marked out to the coordinates from the undies drawer. So we planned the day. We packed morning tea, we packed lunch, we packed afternoon tea, and we started at 8:30 in the morning. And everyone turned up, and the guy with the metal detector said, now I've got to spend 15, 20 minutes just calibrating it. So he said, I may as well start somewhere. Where would you like me to start? And I had my bit of string, and I said, right where my toe is. So we started there, threw his headphones off and yelled, nearly blew his eardrums off. Straight down was our plug. So what the hell were we going to do with morning tea, lunch and afternoon tea, I tell you. So we put in this great irrigation pipe to mark the spot and covered it all back over again. But this is the sort of list of burials that we have confirmed in that cemetery. And we're not talking a couple of babies. If it was today, there'd probably be an inquiry, but Granny buried both husbands there. A daughter who sadly committed suicide, some neighbours' families and some children and babies. But a quite extensive list, and certainly the death certificates absolutely confirmed who is buried there. Everyone except Granny. That's her headstone down at the Point Lonsdale Cemetery at Queenscliff. So Granny, she really was an amazing woman, and she was responsible for getting me involved in so many different areas of research. But of course, she wasn't the only woman in that era, earlier and later, who filled these sort of roles. Didn't matter whether we're talking the 19th century or early 20th century. And she absolutely got me sucked in to researching, in particular, midwives and nurses. And I have a website which, for people who know me, I'm from the Geelong district, and I have a big website and a database that now has more than 1.7 million records from the region, from all sorts of different sources, whether it be Public Record Office records that we've identified for our area, bits from newspapers, personal diaries, other indexes that the local family history group have contributed so much, and also, in particular, all the little local histories that, anyone who's a researcher, you get one of these books, little books about this size, and you know what you do first. You read the title, and then you open the back cover to look for the index. And most of them aren't there because they were produced in an era when individuals and small societies could not afford an extra 4 pages to include an index in a booklet. It was enough to just get the booklet published with some sort of cover. And so we made it our habit of finding any book that mentioned any of the towns in our region and indexing them and adding them to it. And one of the ones that I did was, because we had a collection of birth, death and marriage certificates, was I decided that, hey, we don't need the doctors because there's a wonderful index by one of our local people, Stephen Dew, who used to be at Geelong Hospital, of the Australian Medical Pioneers Index. Absolute magnificent index. But I thought, well, hang on, you know, there's this section on all birth certificates that has the accoucheur, the nurse, etc. And so we started looking at our local ones, and I ended up with 94 entries in an index, which is a pretty pathetic little index. What I couldn't understand was looking at the statistics on my website, was the statistics of people looking at this index. 3 times as many people looked at the write-up on the Midwives Index to all the other indexes, and I had over 300 indexes. So why was everybody besotted by midwives? And that got me well and truly sucked in. And people would say, oh, I had an ancestor who was a midwife. And I'd go, yeah, who? Oh, I can't remember her name. So midwives got me sucked in as well. Now, generally, tracing female ancestors isn't terrifically easy. You can find out when they were born. You can find out when they got married. You can find out when they had their 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids or whatever, and when they died. And their life in between is nothing. Their husband's life, he will appear on rate books and electoral rolls and everything under the sun, but not the wife. And we all know that in the 19th century, many, many teachers were forced to give up their job unless they were the wife of the head teacher and could fill the role of sewing teacher. Otherwise, they were required to give up their job. I remember going to a talk at the Lara school, the Duck Pond school, and they had the rules from the... Now, if Jack was here, he'd tell me whether it was the Education Department or the Department of Education, and the rules stated, you get married, you're out. No question about it. And so teachers had to give up their jobs, as did many others. But midwives and nurses didn't. And that opened up a whole new avenue of researching. And one of the biggest problems of research is you get sidetracked. And boy, did this one sidetrack me. I do not mention it again in my talk because it could be a talk in its own right. It's been mentioned on and off a little during the day, but the marriage bar. This particular publication I got through Deakin University, but I think you've got it here at the State Library as well. And it comes up with some amazing quotes. You read it, and it's just as well I live on my own with my pussycat, because I would start screaming and yelling, going, how dare they say those things? You know, quotes like, every female officer in the public service shall be deemed to have retired from the Commonwealth Service upon her marriage. This was October 1966. We're not talking the 19th century. And, I mean, there were some other absolute doozies, things like, now I jotted down a few words, things like, and this was always, excuse me guys, this was always men with these wonderful quotes, who said that there was an expected job of women at home doing what they should be doing. Got that, ladies? Got the message? As I said, midwives and nurses were really the exception in this particular discussion. And as I said before, why were they so popular in the indexes that I had on my database? And I think one of the reasons, there were a lot of them around, they weren't forced to give up their work, and so there was a potential of researching them and following their careers. And once you knew how to do it, they weren't that hard to follow. And I've got a couple of key methods for researching them. So, where do we start? It's been mentioned so many times today. The first place we look is in our newspapers. And here we're talking about Trove, the online newspapers, and there are more online than just in Trove, and also through your local and family history groups. You would be surprised, and I don't think they've been mentioned enough today, just how many local history and family history groups have amazing resources for your research. And particularly something like this, where you're trying to research a bit more locally. Now, I've already said Geelong is my region, and so just as an example, I searched on Trove for Midwife in the Geelong Advertiser. My favourite newspaper, I've got to tell you, it is amazing. Now, of course, you can narrow it down by dates, times, and various other things, but I got 503 hits on Midwife, just in the Geelong Advertiser. And so you can get quite creative, but the sort of things that they appeared in the papers for were advertisements. You would be surprised how often midwives advertised. The police courts and a good regional paper or city paper will have a regular police court update, and in some cases it could be wage disputes. It could be indexes. I mentioned Grannie Ferris, inquests. Grannie Ferris, who gave statements at various inquests because sadly often babies died during or very soon after birth, and general articles. Now we're talking back as far as 1849 that some of these articles came up. And ironically, this one mentions Felix Place in South Geelong, which is that far away from where I now live in South Geelong, which was the original Geelong, not where we know Geelong City is today, but South Geelong by the river was where Geelong was first established. Now, this example on the right, Mrs. McKenna, having been in practice as midwife during a period of 25 years, respectfully intimates that she is ready to give her attendance in that capacity in this district. To those who may favour her with their confidence and encouragement, she begs to state that nothing will be wanting on her part to merit their approval. Those ladies to whom she may not be known are informed that the most respectable references can be given. It was serious business being a midwife. The other one was about Mrs. Drummond, who'd come over from Hobart. And so many people moved from Hobart to Geelong, Melbourne, and other parts of Victoria. And she not only said she had respectable references, she named important people and places where she had provided her service as a midwife. Now, she was deadly serious about setting herself up in Geelong because she advertised 3 times in a week. And you know how I said I get sidetracked on research? How expensive was it to advertise back then? It cost 3 shillings for the first 6 lines, 3p a line above that number, and you got discount if you inserted your advertisement more than twice. Hence, she advertised 3 times. She made sure she got the discount. But back in 1845, a good pair of trousers would cost 1.5 times what a basic little advertisement was. So one, she obviously wasn't short of money, but two, she realised the value of advertising and paying for that advertising to ensure that she got plenty of business. And if we looked in 1854, we had an article in the police courts where she was claiming, Louisa Smith was claiming money that was due her as a nurse and midwife to Mr. Last's wife. And she claimed it was £6, and one would presume that that was for one delivery and looking after her through the birth and things. So, hey, it was a worthwhile business. And you know how you get sidetracked? Anyone got any ideas on how you could be a midwife? I love this quote from March 1854 in England. Any mother who has once been a mother or once attended at a birth may forthwith establish herself as a midwife. So I presume there's quite a few women in this room could go, yeah, midwife. So obviously references were important. And I loved this article, again in the court. An elderly female of the name Allen was before the court claiming 25 shillings that she alleged was due to her. There was a very astute judge who at the end saw in her favour because the infant that the defendant carried in her arms was proof she'd done her job. We've got a living baby. She claims she delivered it. Therefore, she warrants being paid. So there's a massive amount of detail in different articles you'll find in the newspapers. This particular one was about an inquest. But again, the judge found in favour of the midwife and that it was not her fault that the infant had died during delivery. So there is a massive amount of information you can get by researching in newspapers. Place number 2, birth certificates. Now, if you don't know how birth certificates in Victoria were created, then you need to research it. So you get sidetracked and you learn all sorts of amazing stuff in the process. And in this case, you'll find that births were registered at what is called a sub-registry. So, for example, we had one at Geelong, and local births would be registered in that register chronologically. As they're registered, they get added. And then, quarterly, those registers were sent to head office in Melbourne, and they were compiled. They were kept in their sub-districts and put together and allocated a statewide number. It's why you get 2 numbers. You can just see a number down the side. That's the local number. This one is the state number. So that's why they have 2 numbers. And if you look down that list, you'll see the 3 longer arrows, red arrows. They're all the same person. Here we have 5 births registered at Newington, which is where Granny lived, but 3 with the same name. And though they were registered at Newington, 1 was for a birth in Moolap, 2 were for births in Kensington, which became Leopold, so they're neighbouring towns. But why is the same lady listed there? Because midwife, Mrs. Barker, midwife, midwife, midwife. And it's how, by using your local historical society or family history group, who often have collections of birth certificates for the region, and you think that your ancestor may have been a midwife there, have a look and see if this name keeps bobbing up, because that is proof that these were midwives working in the region. Now, the third source is my favourite, and what a lot of this is about is official records. And there is nothing wrong with newspapers, there is nothing wrong with diaries or oral history. But in this case, this is government documents saying, yep, she's a midwife. And it was because of Granny, and unfortunately Granny doesn't appear on any because she died in 1910, which was 6 years before these official registers commenced. And in the Government Gazette in the 20th century, midwives and nurses had to be registered by the government. If they were, they then appeared in the Government Gazette. And for midwives, so far, what I found, midwives appear in there from 1916 to 1957, and nurses from 1925 to 1957. Now, I've left a gap, those first few years of nurses, in case I've missed something and I eventually find them again. But that is quite a lot of years of coverage in these absolutely wonderful registers in the Victoria Government Gazette. Now, I do know that this session is being recorded and will appear on the State Library's website, but if you want to jot down one thing from today's session, is one of my blogs. And it's really easy to remember, justlovehistory.com. It tells you everything about me. I love history. Because the further I got into this research, I thought, well, hang on, this has taken me months to track through, find all these references in the government gazettes and download them all, massive files. And if I use my blog, I can tell everyone about them. So if you go to my blog, justlovehistory.com, and if you click in the search box, put in midwives, and the blog about midwives will come up. Now, what I tried to do was to add into my blog these tables I'd created that I'll show you in a minute, but they didn't come up terribly well in the blog. So instead, I've created 2 PDF files that you can download. So just go to justlovehistory.com, search for midwives. In that article, you'll find these 2 links to PDF files. One is for nurses and one is for midwives. And now I'll show you why you'll want to do it. This is part of the spreadsheet I did of all of the lists of midwives in the Government Gazette. And basically, what they did, as at the 31st of December every year, they compiled the year's list of midwives. In many cases, new registrations, deleted registrations, change of name by marriage, change of address by marriage, unbelievably useful information. It would give you their maiden name and their married name if they changed during the year. And they were then published quite often about February or March the following year in the Government Gazette. It wasn't always the same time. And that's why it took me forever compiling these lists of what publication of the Government Gazette they appeared in. And that's why I thought I'd share that in these files. I've put in a strange column is the page numbers, because as long as you've got the first page, you've got everything. But I put that in there because if your eyes go down that list, you'll find somewhere there's a dozen page numbers in the range. And that would be a normal issue of midwives. as in additions, deletions, changes, whatever. But every now and again you find one, like the one I've marked, that is 30 to 40 pages long. That will give you a clue that that's one of the years when they put the whole register, the current register, into the Government Gazette. And these tables were quite amazing. This was the nurses one, and you'll see where I couldn't find anything for these early years. I have spent months searching, and I don't think they're there, but hey, it looked nice to use the same layout as the midwives. And this is the nurses one. And again, as at the 31st of December every year, that was their annual register. And maybe February, maybe March the following year, sometimes a little bit later, they would be published in the Government Gazette for the previous year. Now, if you don't know, you've got rocks in your head. But of course, on the State Library website, you can access and download all of the Victoria Government Gazettes. Sometimes, and don't take offence, I found the odd one where it just won't download or there's a fault with it or something. And so there is a backup site that you should use, which is the Australian government site. It's, it comes through a university education project that it's online, and it's for all of Australia. It doesn't include government gazettes for all of Australia, but you could waste a couple of weeks browsing around this site. There's some amazing things in there, but one of them is also the Victoria Government Gazette. If you had problems downloading one copy, try the other site, and they're two excellent resources. Now, the sort of thing you get on these lists, and it's quite phenomenal. Obviously, the name of the midwife, this is for midwives. They were registered and got a registration number that lived with them for the rest of their registered life as a midwife. It gave an address, it gave a date that they were registered, and the relevant act that they were registered under. And you might notice on those tables I included a couple that gave you the rules and regulations of being a midwife or a nurse. It told you what year they were registered during, if they were removed from registration, if they were restored to a register. And often you would find that a midwife gave up being a midwife, had her own children, went back to being a midwife, and they were restored to the register. Excuse me, but we run out of glasses that weren't used. It also includes alterations, change of name by marriage or any other reason, change of address. And if your ancestor was a midwife, you would love that sort of information. And that's what a register looks like out of the Government Gazette. For nurses, you got similar information. They also had supplementary lists for different reasons, but the bit I loved, and particularly if you're doing some local history, was the hospital where they were trained as a nurse. And that was quite extensive and quite useful information. A typical nurses register out of the Government Gazette. So on those two PDF files that I mentioned, that lists every single issue of the Government Gazette that includes a midwife register and includes a nurses register. And you've got all that information there. The fourth place to look is, don't forget, local histories, local family documents, other sources that might mention children or births, etc. And I know this might sound funny, but please don't ignore social media and the benefits there. Now, the Bellarine Historical Society that I'm part of, we know from looking at our local birth records that Emmeline Hancock was a local midwife in Drysdale. She has a street named after her. Midwives were important members of the community. Once word got out that I was into not just cemeteries, but midwives and nurses, what I love is people like you who get in touch and say, my great-granny was a midwife. Would you like a photograph? And photographs make a name a real person. This one was Heather Cook got in touch with me. I'd given talks to some of their local groups over that way. And this was her ancestor, who, a bit like Grannie Ferris, had been married more than once and so had different names. And she was a midwife and a nurse in Birregurra in Western Victoria. Not only did she have this beautiful photograph, they still had her official certificate of registration from the Midwives Board dated in 1918. Right? And that was part of their family collection. And to add to the story of Euphemia was you can't be a midwife 24 hours a day. There are not that many children born in a small country town. And so she actually ran the local convenience store in Birregurra as well. And to get these sort of documents and photographs of real midwives is just an absolute joy. Now, another one was a girl that I worked with at the GSV and said that her nana, as she called her, was a tad pretentious because they found amongst her possessions a business card, Mrs. Rosina Annie Black. And she said, Nanny always said she was a midwife, but I don't believe her. Well, I'm sorry, 35 years she appeared on the official Midwives Register. And Nolene was just absolutely flabbergasted. She said, we thought she was just saying she was. No, she wasn't just saying it, she really was. And of course, I couldn't get away without getting a photograph of who, she used to be called Annie Black, 35 years a midwife. I gave part of this talk at Colac a few months ago, and one of the people who came along to the workshop, and she herself was, I think from memory, a double certificate nurse, was retired, and she had an ancestor, and she said, but she won't be on your list. And I said, oh, that's a shame. When was she a midwife? And they said, oh, late 19th century, fair enough. And up until 1914, 14? Whatever the year, I said, hang on, that's a couple of years after the official registrations came out. Are you sure she wasn't registered? Oh no, she wouldn't have been. Now, I had given to the Historical Society a USB with all of the files that I've downloaded because I thought, if it took me months, it's going to take little societies ages to get these things. And there are 71 files, about 132 megabytes worth of stuff. But because I live on technology, I took all of those files, ran them through Acrobat Professional, which means I could search the folder once, all of the 71 files in one search by doing it that way. And I'd given them a copy of these to secretly put on their computer, and we announced it at the end. And this girl, I said, look, if suddenly you had official midwives and your wife's going to give birth and you want a midwife, are you going to pick anyone or go for somebody who appears in an official register? And she said, oh yeah, but she wouldn't have been there. Guess who we found on the register? Yes! And look, it just goes to prove it is an absolutely wonderful subject for research. It's easy to research. There's a heap of information out there at different periods during the year, but it is a wonderful way of researching. And Jan, to save you coming all the way up here, do you want me to mention, or do you want to mention the USB? Okay, what I've done for VAFO, I've given them a copy of that USB with all of the files. And VAFO are happy that any VAFO member, if you send a USB to VAFO, and you've only got to look up the website, has got the address and everything, make sure you've got a stamped self-addressed envelope to send the USB back, and Jan will copy all of those files for you. So it will save particularly country groups who it's not easy downloading a heap of stuff on the internet. And so it means that VAFO can supply all of those files to you on one USB. You've just got to send them the USB and an envelope to come back. You will have a ball. If you've got anyone you suspect of being a nurse or a midwife in the 20th century, you'll find these really helpful. So I hope that's given you an insight into midwives and nurses and why women are important and should be allowed to do the job they want to do, not what men think they should do. Thanks, everybody.